This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. This podcast is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. If you're looking for help, seek out a qualified medical services provider or other healthcare professional. Welcome to the Live Your Yoga podcast, a podcast dedicated to discovering and sharing all the ways in which yoga can be lived off the mat. Real stories by real people, just like you.
Welcome to the Live Your Yoga podcast. Over the next few months, we are featuring some of the fantastic podcast episodes featured in our trauma-informed yoga course. The course itself is filled with wisdom, insight, and actionable steps and practices we can take to help heal ourselves and the world around us. These podcast episodes are windows into some of the course content, and we hope you enjoy this series. You can find out more info about the course by clicking the link below.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this podcast. I'm joined by Nancy and our wonderful special guest and who we have on the podcast today is Amanda. And Amanda, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you know yourself much better than I do. And I think you'll give us a really great sort of concise little background about who you are and why we've brought you here today.
I'm Amanda. I am a registered psychotherapist. I've been practicing for about 15 years. I run a small clinic here in Ontario, meaning that I have some folks that work for me and with me who are really integral to my practice as well. I do a lot of mentoring with new clinicians in the field and supporting. And my areas of focus are really trauma, anxiety, and stress management. I would say too that for the purposes of this conversation, it's probably important to highlight that I'm a mom to a wonderful trans non-binary child who we're trying to raise with confidence and grace and elegance and letting them really be who they are.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, that's really why we wanted to talk to you today, because you've been integral in helping us to create so much of what we've put together, and also just because of who you are, your background, and the knowledge that you have on this particular topic, which I didn't start with, but the topic is how to create gender inclusive or gender affirming yoga classes. And before we even dive into that, I'd just be really curious because you mentioned that you're trying to support your child through this process. And I just wondered generally, what is that experience like in the world for you as parents, navigating a world where you're helping or trying to help your child to live their best life in a society that maybe sometimes isn't super conducive to that?
Yeah, that is always a really interesting question, because in terms of just being inside our walls as a family, it's wonderful. And I have this person who's just always lived out loud and not been afraid. And from the start, you just tell that this kid lives their best life. They're just authentically who they are. But it's when you get out into the larger world and navigating how you allow them to do that, but also how you protect them when you have to. So I'll give you an example. We're talking about we did go to Disney World, and we had to talk about the fact that Florida is not a state that is very friendly for trans folk. And there are some states where if I were raising my child could be apprehended. So we had to talk like, this experience could be problematic and I don't want you to miss out on it. And there are things that we have to think about. And we had to have that conversation as a family about how we were going to move forward, right? So it turns out there are very lovely trans affirming and queer friendly groups out there that help you to navigate these things. And we ended up doing it, but we had to be really planful about how we were going to get through customs and go straight from the airport to Disney World, which is actually a very wonderful queer space. And it was a very safe and lovely experience once we were there, but it was planning to get there. Right. And even there's a lot of justification that goes into it. You get a lot of questions from people, and sometimes it's just curiosity, and that's great. Like having conversation is always great, but it's a lot of like, well, how does your child really know that they're non-binary or trans? And you would never ask that of a cis person. We just all know inherently who we are. but you have to really justify that when you grew up in a way that's like less fitting of the norm that society tells us that it should be. Right. In the piece I wrote for the course, this one example that I always think of is when my kid was tiny and you asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up, they would always say Batman. And every single person who looked at would look at this poor child and be like, you mean Batwoman, sweetie? It's a superhero. Nobody is going to grow up to be a superhero anyway. Like what the necessity of that correction was, I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
How old is your child now, Amanda?
11.
Okay.
11.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
We've been very fortunate in that like we've had a really positive experience with the school. They've been very supportive. They created a gender neutral washroom for our kid. They decided that they don't like it because it's the only one they had available. It was like the teacher's washroom. So they felt that that was really strange and uttering, and they said it smelled weird. So they use the boys' bathroom now. And we did have an incident where there was kind of like some hostility, I would say, from some of the other boys. And like, there's a girl in the boys' bathroom, and some othering and some yelling. And I called the school, and right away they addressed it in a way that I think was sensitive and supportive of those kids who are also learning too. Like, I don't think it's always necessarily meant to be harmful, right?
Well, and that age, it's such a challenging age anyways, as hormones kick in and social norms start feeding in. So yeah.
When you're raising a child who is non-binary trans, because you have to start at this point making decisions about puberty blockers.
Yeah, huge decisions. Huh?
Yeah. Which, as far as anyone knows, are safe and effective to use, but it does stunt your growth. So we had to have that conversation. Like, we can give you these medications and they will prevent you from developing breasts or hips or all those sorts of things, but you're going to be shorter than the rest of the kids. And which one of those options is more palatable?
Yeah, adds a whole other level to parenting.
Oh, the other layer to that is finding supportive medical care, right? Because it's time sensitive. And I have a doctor who's a little old school, who she doesn't support gender inclusivity necessarily, but she's open enough to make a referral. So we can go on to the gender clinic and but sometimes accessing trans affirming healthcare, the wait list can be up to 2 years long, depending on your community. And 2 years for an 11-year-old, that's too wide a window. It's too late to start looking at some puberty blockers in some senses by that point.
It clearly just baffles my mind that people care so much about gender, right? Like, to me, it doesn't matter. It's who the person is. It's just like, who cares? But there's such this like panic and fear around it. Like, oh my God, you can't do that. It's like, why? You're, like you said, your kid is just living the best life that they want to live. What's wrong with that?
And that's the thing. Like, why can't people just present as who they are? We all choose our clothes, choose our hairstyle, choose whatever we want. Why should it be limiting in other ways also, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's such a patriarchal paradigm, I think.
Absolutely.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, for me, the very tricky thing as a parent too, is like having to feel things out before you start talking about, like, Sylvie uses they, them pronouns, right? So I have to kind of feel it out and make sure it's going to be cool. And there are absolutely some family members that we don't have contact with at this point.
It's we're very fortunate, the knowledge that you have, because you're sitting here with us today as the parent of a transgender person. You are a psychotherapist, psychologist, right? Sorry, did I say that wrong? Psychotherapist. And you're a yoga teacher.
Yes.
So we're very fortunate, because I think that something that we're very interested in learning a little bit more about you is, what can we do as yoga teachers because you mentioned, and I think it's really sort of like lodged itself in my chest, that at home you have this safe space, and it's going out there in the world where a person might be encountering these spaces that aren't so safe. And through the context of kind of teaching trauma-informed yoga and having safe spaces for people to go to, where maybe it's like another hub in the city that they're living, that they know where they can arrive and they're going to be safe and supported there, and in a community of people who are there to make this a great experience for everybody. So as yoga teachers who want to create more inclusive yoga classes, how can we do that through the lens of gender inclusivity, and what might that look like? Like, have you noticed as a yoga teacher that there is just inherently built into the world of yoga a lot of non-gender inclusivity?
I think like the nice thing about yoga is there's a lot of like invitational aspects, which kind of lends itself to being gender inclusive, and that like we're giving options, we're giving cues, we're giving alternatives so that people can access what feels good in their body in any given day, which is really helpful. But I would say what we can do in terms of creating safe space is, like I was mentioning before, when you're navigating this world, particularly because it is such a fraud issue, you have to put out feelers to see if disclosing being trans or being non-binary is safe. Putting it out there very in the forefront so people don't have to do the guesswork is going to take a lot of the mental load off of that person. So, you know, if you're in a studio, are you able to put up a pride flag, and particularly one that has, called the Pride Progress. It has that triangle on the side that includes the black, the white, the brown, the pink, and the blue for trans and non-binary folk. Making it very visible that you have policies that are supportive of trans non-binary folks, right? I think, you know, even deciding ahead of time, if you're teaching a live class and a person is made to feel uncomfortable and they speak to the teacher, is that teacher going to know how to address it so that that space becomes safe again, right? If someone's feeling stared at or looked at or othered in some capacity, or someone makes a comment, what can we do to reestablish safety at that point and address the issue in a way that's probably also sensitive for that student, right? If and where possible, and I know like space is limiting in this factor, having gender neutral washrooms. If washrooms are gendered, I think making sure that there's receptacles for menstrual products in all the washrooms, regardless if it's like labeled male or female, change tables in both for that matter as well, which is beyond trans inclusivity. That's just gender equity as well, right?
Yeah.
Even on your website, making sure that that you have outward signs that this would be a safe place and that you're open to feedback and discussion if the space isn't matching what people's needs are at that time. And I think other than that, like, you know, making sure that we don't address people by gendered terms. So if you're trying to get someone's attention, just excuse me or pardon me instead of like ma'am or sir, or addressing someone as man or woman unless it's been very clearly disclosed to you. Not assuming what people's gender is. If you're making introductions or you have nameplates, you could consider putting your pronouns down as well, because what that does is just shows that it's safe to indicate what your pronouns are. I think it's also important not to force people to share pronouns, because sometimes when people are still exploring and discovering what gender is for them, they either have to pick with the gender that they're seen as, that might create some dysphoria, or they have to out themselves before they're ready to. So just creating some fluidity in that capacity as well for people to show up as they are and present themselves as they need to at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting.
I love the idea of the flag, and which made me think of in promotional material to include that inclusivity in your imaging, right? Like it's to just put it out there so clearly. So it's like, it's not an issue. It's just this is who we are, right? Yeah.
You don't have to walk in that space and wonder, is it going to be safe for me?
Exactly. It's just there. It's, oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing too, is like, I've been in a lot of studios that sell clothing, and like purchasing clothing for trans folk can be particularly sensitive. And I work a lot in the trans community as a therapist as well. And they'll say to me, like, sometimes the most nerve-wracking thing you can do is walk into a store to buy clothes, because right away you're wondering, am I passing enough? Or are people going to look at me weird and ask, why am I in this space? So just making sure you're setting up clothing racks, or not looking at people or telling them they're in the wrong space, and making that aspect comfortable for them as well.
Mark and I did a piece on holding space, and you were speaking about that in a more specific way. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about some ideas? So if I'm a yoga teacher and I'm in a live class and there's bodies out there, and I notice that some of the students are not accepting another student, or maybe looking at them, or, you know, commenting, depending on the age group, or there is some kind of issue. Can you give some advice to the yoga teacher to how they might deal with that situation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one too. And also, like, it's that fine line between calling out and calling in too, right? When you need to put your foot down and say, hey, this is not okay, versus like, hey, maybe this is based in curiosity and a learning journey for you, but you should also be aware that you're making someone else feel very uncomfortable, and how you navigate some of that, right? And you're right that, like, to be a trans or non-binary person at times can be just this highly, highly visible existence. And this is kind of the lens of that trauma-informed practice, is like, you are part of a minority community, and you feel, I've had people say to me, like, you always feel the eyes on you. So if you notice that that person is being ogled or looked at, or people are trying to determine that, giving that side eye, you can maybe just move your body and walk through the room, because I think your natural movement is just going to divert attention away. Right. But also not like call out, make that person feel more uncomfortable.
Like
right.
Yeah. Or an opportunity to perhaps introduce the yamas.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
What I found really interesting about your answer, it was more about, like, two things really stuck out. One was not about sort of forcing people to give pronouns or to share information that they're not comfortable with, because I actually heard from a friend recently who said it's not sometimes safe for them to share their pronouns. And, you know, it's become this common practice, I think, at least in experiences I've had where I've been in spaces, and it becomes this common thing that we do at the beginning of meeting people, and whether it's done just to sort of because people think that they need to be doing it and that's the right thing to do, but there's a lot of subtlety to it. And in any situation, I would assume when we're forcing people to give information or putting them in a position where they might feel forced to share information that to us might feel like I would feel perfectly safe sharing that information, but having that awareness that, like, okay, I'm trying to be inclusive, but am I creating a safe space for everybody whilst taking the steps that I think I need to be inclusive? It's not just about sharing everything and having everything out in the open. There's so much nuance to it. Yeah.
And for some people, they don't identify with a gender at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like, and I know folks that don't have preferred pronouns. They just, you know, any old pronoun will do. It's fine. Right. Or I know, like, someone like my kid, like, their number one preference is they, them, but it's difficult for a lot of people to they, them, because I have a hard time making that singular. So Sylvie, who goes by Sylvie, will be like he, him, they, them. It's fine. But if you have to go with a singular one, go with he, him. And sometimes though, like, I've been at church meetings recently, and, like, not church meetings. My grandmother passed away. So we were chatting with some of the older folks there, and they were like, and what's your son's name? Because they're prepubescent and they pass very well as male. I'd be like, Sylvia. They're like, wait, what? Sylvia. So is that like a French version of, like, I just nod it off and you just keep rolling with it, but just be cool and avoid intrusive questions. Don't ask about people's transition, whether it's been medicalized or not. Don't ask, like, are you a boy? Why do you do this? Why do you not do that? These folks are highly visible anyway. So just be cool.
And I like what you said about how you dealt with that, with the context you were in and the generation. It's like, there's no point in getting into it, right? It's just like, see you later. Have a nice day.
Exactly.
I have a question about, because you mentioned doing things like putting pride flag, like the flag, and washrooms and things like that. What if you're a yoga teacher who's teaching at someone else's studio, and those are not super obvious things that you can do or offer? You know, like, say you're teaching at a Good Life Fitness, and I don't know if they have them, but say, for example, they didn't have those things. Is there anything that you could do right off the bat as a yoga teacher, or some wording you could use to let people know that this is a welcoming and safe space? Like, how would you broach that?
this is where my therapist hat comes in, is I always find it easiest to approach things like you don't know the answer. So instead of, hey, you should have, which makes people very defensive, I'm like, I'm wondering if you've ever considered putting a pride sticker up and what that might mean for your place, right? Because people just engage with that in a much different way, right? And I think that's what the advocacy looks like. Or like, hey, like if you notice some things that might be a little bit out of line, just, hey, I'm wondering if you noticed this and what you think about that. Right there, you're opening a conversation as opposed to dictating, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're giving agency to the studio owner as opposed to calling them on not having something, right?
Yeah. And you're inviting them to just be curious about their own approach in their own space. And it might just invite some deeper reflection on their part. Yeah.
No, that's such a good answer too, because it's sort of like that, create the change you wish to see in the world. Instead of doing it in a combative way or noticing that there's a lack, is like noticing that there is that lack, but then taking the steps to help that be changed as a whole. So it's not just your class that might be that safe space, but can we make the entire organization, like can we show that as an organization that we are supportive and welcoming, and that this is important to us.
Yeah. And even things like, in Toronto, we have this fabulous organization called the 519 that does a lot of like community building, but also education and resources. Like support your local queer positive group and see if they can come in and say like, hey, I know of this organization. What might it be like if we invited them in to do a workshop for our teachers, right? If they're open to that sort of conversation, right?
I've noticed, and I'd love to get your thought on this. Like, I'd noticed that maybe it's not happening as much now, but I noticed there was a period where sort of queer yoga classes or yoga classes that were sort of showing that, hey, we're open to welcoming everybody to this particular workshop that we're offering and things like this. Which is interesting in a way, and maybe it was happening at a certain time in the world where that was really important to put out there. But is that a great thing for yoga teachers to offer, or should we be thinking more globally? Like all of our teachers, everything that we're doing, everything that we're offering should be that therefore we don't need this special workshop, this special class at Pride. Like that, all these things should be just inherently built into the system, that we don't need to draw attention to the fact that we're doing this one-off thing.
I actually think it's a both and. I think like we should be making it known that it is globally inclusive. And I do think there's something really magical about having space for community, right? That whole piece about being hyper visible, to be in a room full of folks that you don't feel visible amongst, is very magical, right? So
that's such a good answer.
I think the other thing too is just thinking about like that marketing piece too. Like, yes, marketing like queer inclusive courses, but also prenatal yoga is so often marketed for moms or women, and it may not necessarily be. You may have a non-binary folk, you might have trans men that may want to participate in prenatal yoga as well. So making sure we're tailoring that marketing for inclusivity, especially.
If you're, say you're a yoga teacher and they're listening to this and then they're like, how can I tell if I am being inclusive in my classes? I'm like thinking like, what if there's something in my classes that is othering? We have an assignment that we created for the course where people film or record themselves teaching, and then they analyze to sort of go over the cues that they're giving to see if they are invitational.
Yeah.
So I wondered along the lines of that, like a good sort of practice might be to just review, because I can't think of a ton of really obvious examples, but I can think of a few things in just the world of teaching yoga where, there's certain poses where we sometimes give the caveat of, if you're menstruating, or if like there's particular things that might, and the language around that might be, if you're, maybe the teacher says, if you're female and you're menstruating at this moment in time, those kind of things are really easy to change. But would you suggest if someone's like unsure if they are on the right path, to maybe just sort of review a little bit of what it is that they're putting out there in the world and see if it is if it is sort of lining up with what they want to offer?
I think, yeah, it's just like going back and just listening for that neutrality, right? Like not equating bodily functions with genders, right? Like menstruation is a perfect example of that too. And I've been in classes where teachers are even uncomfortable saying menstruation. So they'll call it things like ladies' vacation or like kind of cutesier terms, but that's not what it is, right? And you're right. Like just make it, is it gender neutral? Instead of saying like, ladies and gentlemen or whatever, it's like students, folks, all referring to people as partners, just more of that kind of neutrality in language and more unassuming in the language that we're presenting. And I think another one to really, really be mindful of is cueing mulabunda, right? Because a lot of people also give that cue in terms of whether you're a man or a woman. And some trans folks are very comfortable with the genitals that they have and some are not. And even drawing attention to the genitals, depending on what stage you're in and how you're feeling at that moment, could be deeply uncomfortable. So just thinking about what kind of safeguards could be in place for that. And it's tough because I think that is a really important one. Like I've injured myself because I'm quite flexible and I have a little bit of a pelvic tilt. It's really important for me to cue those bundas. So we can't leave it out. But I think we all just have to really think about how we're cueing it in a way that's maybe less triggering.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. I hadn't even thought about that piece, right? Yeah. Very important.
Well, I noticed that a lot, especially when we get to sort of the more esoteric parts of yoga and we get into the chakras and the masculine and feminine energy, the yin, the yang, how can we start to think about even those terms that are so gendered when we're talking about the energy body and things like this in a yoga class?
That's the challenging piece, isn't it? So I think what we can be invitational about is thinking about how these are like very traditional presentations based on very traditional knowledge we had at the time, and our understanding is really expanded. So how can we modernize that understanding of male and female energy? Or how do we understand that like masculine energy isn't exclusive to men, right? Women can have some masculine energy and vice versa. Like it's not necessarily about the embody that the energy is inside of, right? We all have aspects of this. We're all open to it. We can all tap into it, regardless of the bodies that we were born into.
This whole course is about updating ourselves to be more contemporary human beings if we're yoga teachers or not. And like all the new science around hormones, around microbiome, around epigenetics, all of that, like those ancient systems, I don't think they were so gendered. I think it was just understanding that we have these different forms of energies, and that somehow along the line, the path of history, they did get very gendered. Does that make sense? And I think now it's like, let's just update ourselves and be contemporary human beings and read and figure out what's going on in the world.
I just had a moment where it came into my mind, especially in yin yoga, we talk a lot about the kind of the masculine, the feminine, like that yin yang thing. And then I'm thinking, like, if even saying masculine and feminine, would that be then, even if we're not meaning it in that direct sense to somebody, but would that create a sense of like, oh no, are we approaching this part of learning about yoga where we're going to start to be really this or that? But saying maybe something like this cooling energy and a warming energy, or sort of finding, like we do to work on our invitational tuning, to find ways to say the same thing, but in a way that we're not even broaching on what might be the super gendered way of explaining it, even if we're not intending that. Because again, for me, I would imagine in terms of like, I know that I've been in a space where people have said things that maybe weren't directed to me, but made me question, are we going to be getting up to the part where we have to start coming out, or are we getting to the place where this is going to be an issue for me? So just finding a way to not even have to delve into that at that moment in time, because we're with people for such a brief period of time. And if we're really wanting just to create this wonderful, safe space, do we need to even use those words? Or am I totally off base?
No, I like what you're saying. And I like that, like the cooling and the heating. And I think sometimes it's almost like one's more of like an introverted energy and one's more of an extroverted energy even. And there's all sorts of ways that we can like reinterpret that knowledge and embody it and package it in a way that's palatable.
Well, even in terms of the nervous system, it could be, you're in the more sympathetic or parasympathetic. Mm-hmm. Like we have all of these dualities within us, as does nature, as does everything. So yeah, I think there's so many ways we can talk about those different energies without genderizing it.
And I think this is kind of the point too, is that gender is not a binary. And we all have aspects of the traditional masculine and the traditional feminine, regardless of the bodies we're born into or how we present ourselves when we walk through the world. None of us is that binary mold.
It's such a helpful way to think about it too, is that what might be in our minds seen as the binary is much more of a spectrum. So even in when we're talking about the energy body and the sort of the more esoteric parts of yoga, the way that we explain them or have been explaining them for the recent part of history is like, okay, well, it's so much more helpful to think about a spectrum and to think about where we're maybe arriving on that spectrum at this moment in time, and that being open to the fact that those things are potentially always shifting, whether we're talking about anything like that spectrum is not fixed, and that we can move up and down it as is our right as living beings.
Absolutely. And I think too, like a lot of traditional teachings too, like I can't physically show you a chakra in my body, right? We know it's there, but this is kind of, in a sense, a little bit metaphorical. We can always reinterpret metaphors. There's always a beautiful way to reimagine them and like resuit them for our purposes.
It's so true.
I wanted to thank Amanda for being such a, being at the helm for this course especially in the beginning stages when we were developing it, to really steer us to be mindful of what we were creating. I think this course is going to be so helpful because of your guidance to keep it just very much about informing people, trauma informed. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. And thanks so much for the opportunity to participate. It's really lovely for me as well to be able to kind of spread my wings a bit and do something beyond the typical clinical one-on-one and participate more in community is really a lovely thing.